just Good morning, everyone. As you enter, please just bear with us a few moments as we get our presenter into the panelist side of the room. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to visit the posters, and we will be getting started in a few moments. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back. We have over 300 of you here in our final plenary session. Welcome back. I would like to turn the mic over, and I know you guys are like, what? Nadine's handing over a mic, but I would like to turn the mic over to Neil Mallon, who is our senior training specialist here at the Prevention of Adolescent Risks Initiative. And in this role, He is responsible for implementing and overseeing several of our activities geared towards improving outcomes for child and young adult victims of sex and labor trafficking here in Maryland. So Neil, I am turning it over to you so you can introduce our keynote speaker.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Nadine. It looks like I need my video turned on. I'm looking to try to do that. And more than likely James as well, if someone could enable that so I can share the video. Okay. There we go. Hey there. So first of all, I just want to welcome everyone back and to thank all of the presenters from this morning's breakout sessions, for really excellent presentations that highlighted some great work that's being done to collaborate and establish partnerships across disciplines and service settings to best meet the needs of child victims of trafficking. So as we've said throughout this conference, we are better together. I think all four of those breakout sessions really highlighted the importance of that work. And so we know it was hard for you to be able to kind of choose which session to attend, but luckily the recordings from all four of those will be made available sometime in the upcoming weeks. So you'll have the opportunity to view the ones that you weren't able to join. But at this time, it's my distinct honor to introduce this year's closing plenary speaker, Mr. James Dold, CEO of Human Rights for Kids, a nonprofit organization that he founded in May of 2017 in response to the human rights abuses that children in the US and around the world face on a daily basis. It was his belief, in his words, that by bringing together diverse stakeholders from various ideological and political backgrounds, that we can create a national movement to holistically change society's failure to adequately care for our most marginalized and vulnerable children. His closing plenary session is titled "Gang-Involved Forced Crime is Child Labor Trafficking," a critical topic of conversation that is much needed and necessary to really help our society rethink the way that we look at juvenile crime. I'd like for you to know that we'll have time at the end of the presentation for questions, so please type them into the Q&A so we can make sure to keep track of them. I'm really looking forward to this presentation, to this discussion, to engage with all of you in this critical conversation. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming James Dold.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you again for extending the invitation. My name is James Dold, and I'm the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids, and I'm excited to talk with you all this morning about my presentation, which is really focused on one of the most, I think, forgotten areas of human trafficking, which is children who are forced to commit crimes. And I have a PowerPoint and a video that I'm going to be sharing, so I'm going to go ahead and start and share my screen. I think everyone can see there. In addition to being the founder of Human Rights for Kids, I would be remiss if I did not also mention that I'm a board member at Survivor Alliance, which is a organization that was founded and run by survivors of human trafficking that are working to promote survivor voices in the broader movement. And I'm also a survivor myself, which I'll talk a little bit about more about a little later on. To get us grounded, though, I wanted to really make sure that we all kind of started from an adequate space of understanding the history of the anti-trafficking movement. A lot of folks aren't familiar with some of the developing case law that happened in the late 1980s that really necessitated the need to pass the Trafficking Victims Protection Act back in 2000. And up until this time, the Department of Justice had really been relying on the historical statutes that had been enacted, involuntary servitude, peonage, slavery, to go after what we would look at today as human trafficking crimes. And one of the most seminal cases, Kosminski, happened in 1988, where the US Supreme Court decided a case that had resulted in splits of opinion at the lower court level, where different circuits had allowed for the types of coercive techniques, sort of psychological coercion that we oftentimes think about today in human trafficking cases as being a potential element to prove a case of involuntary servitude. And what happened in the Kosminski case was that there was essentially two brothers who suffered from intellectual disability disorder who had been exploited in what we would call today trafficked on these rural farms. And essentially, the Department of Justice argued that when you looked at the surrounding circumstances, the fact that these two men had these developmental disabilities, the fact that they had been isolated, the fact that threats had been used against them, that if they, tried to leave, even though they weren't being paid any wages, that essentially, they'd be locked away forever. And so the court essentially rejected the prosecution of this case. And one of the things that Justice O'Connor wrote for the majority was that absent change by Congress, for the purposes of criminal prosecution, involuntary servitude necessarily means a condition of servitude in which the victim is forced to work through the use of threat, a physical restraint or physical injury, or by the use or threat of coercion through law or legal process. And she goes on to talk about that this was never meant to be, the statute was never meant to be interpreted broadly, such as using psychological coercion, and far from broadening the definition of involuntary servitude, Congress, did not mean for special protections to be in place for immigrants, children, or folks with intellectual disabilities. And so this was really one of the key cases that in the 1980s that precipitated the need for the TVPA. And, specifically when we begin to look at the language that was enacted in 2000 and subsequently in the reauthorization of 2008, we begin to see how the statute kind of undid what the holding in Kosminski was, right? And so most folks are familiar with the traditional definition of labor trafficking, so I won't go into that in too much detail, but I do want to focus a little bit on the definition of forced labor that's found in 18 USC 1589, where anyone who knowingly provides or obtains labor or services through the use of force, threats of force, physical restraint, or threats of physical restraints, or serious harm is guilty under the statute for forced labor. And the key word here is serious harm. This was the term that really undid what Kosminski limited the DOJ and the federal government to be able to prosecute. And so when we look at that term and what it means, it essentially created this subjective standard by which prosecutors could look at the means of control that were used, the means of threats that were used, or other forms of psychological coercion through a subjective standard through the lens of the victim in that particular case, right? And so when we look at this, it's any harm, physical or non-physical, that under all of the circumstances would compel a reasonable person of the same background in the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing labor or services in order to avoid incurring that harm. And so again, here, when we're talking about the reasonable person, depending on the context that the victim finds themselves in, if it's a person who's an immigrant or a person who suffers from a mental disability, or if it's a child, right? This allows prosecutors to look at the means of control through that lens to see, okay, this was a form of coercion that would compel any child in that same circumstance to continue doing the actions that they were doing, or an immigrant or anybody else, again, who's in the same background and circumstances of the victim. And so this is really important when we begin to think about what we oftentimes term as modern day slavery and how human trafficking has evolved over the years and our understanding of what that means today. So when we look at what does force, fraud, and coercion oftentimes look like for children in the context of labor trafficking and particularly in forced criminality, I've highlighted in green here some of the more pervasive forms of coercion and force and threats that we see with kids who oftentimes find themselves in gang-related situations where they feel unable to leave a gang situation because, again, the threats of violence, threats of retribution, the inability to walk away because of what might happen to their family, and for girls as well, and sometimes boys, the threat of both physical and sexual violence, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But there's a lot of different types of force, fraud, and coercion that can be used in the context of forced criminality that prohibit kids oftentimes from being able to leave gang-like settings. And so, to really understand, I think the overlay between labor trafficking and sex trafficking and sort of how we look at the different elements and understanding that a lot of kids who are in gangs today actually meet the definition of child labor trafficking victims, I think it's also important to understand the evolution of what happened in the sex trafficking context, particularly with child victims, right? So for many years, before the TVPA, and unfortunately this still goes on today, there was this criminalization of a lot of child victims. They weren't looked at as child sex trafficking victims. They were looked at as criminals. They were looked at as, young girls who were involved in, quote unquote, prostitution. That this was a lifestyle choice that they were choosing. Up until a few years ago, we still had thousands of kids every year who were arrested for prostitution-related offenses. Actually, there's a statute that just passed the Maryland legislature that is going to make sure that kids can no longer be arrested here in the state of Maryland. But this is something that has for a long time gone on. And in addition to just, the typical types of crimes related to prostitution, we also saw arrests for drug possession, weapon possessions, trespassing, loitering, and all of these other sorts of offenses. And so oftentimes, again, kids were being arrested and there wasn't this recognition that they were victims. One of the other dynamics that we see at play with sex trafficking victims as well is that, we tend in the movement, I think, to think very myopically about sex and labor trafficking. You're either a victim of sex trafficking or you're a victim of labor trafficking. I think that that paradigm does a lot of damage to the ability to actually identify a lot more victims of human trafficking, in part because so many victims are what I would term dual victims of both labor and sex trafficking, right? So you can imagine a scenario where that you have a sex trafficking victim who during the night is forced to go out, engage in commercial sexual activity with men and then bring that money home. And just because she might be home during the day does not mean that the exploitation or the trafficking stops there, right? You could have a trafficking scenario where threats of violence are used in the home, where if that victim does not provide any other form of labor or services such as childcare, cooking, cleaning, all those sorts of things, that actually again meets the definition of forced labor and labor trafficking, but oftentimes we just label it as just sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And so it's really important that when we begin to look at the elements of the crime itself, we try to apply it through the lens of both labor and sex trafficking. And that's how we can kind of broaden our understanding of what human trafficking is and how it applies in a variety of different contexts in which we don't typically apply it today. So as our understanding of human trafficking, and particularly sex trafficking, has evolved, a number of states, as well as the federal government, as well as a number of bodies such as the American Bar Association, have all began to adopt and encourage the adoption of different types of protection, sort of recognizing that sex trafficking victims oftentimes are required to engage, are in need of special sorts of protections, right? So we have affirmative defense statutes that exist that apply in the context of both prostitution offenses as well as other nonviolent offenses. This is actually something that the American Bar Association has encouraged states to adopt, sort of a blanket immunity for any sort of nonviolent offense that a sex trafficking victim would be forced to engage in at the behest of her trafficker. Now, it's important to recognize that when we're talking about these other nonviolent offenses, it goes out of the sphere of just sex trafficking and into the sphere of labor trafficking, right? Just because a commercial sex act isn't involved doesn't mean that that person again isn't still being trafficked, except the lens shifts, right? From sex trafficking to labor trafficking. And that's a really important component here, is recognizing that the underlying labor or service is actually criminal activity. right? And that's a means by which we can continue to recognize that person as a victim. And it's sort of the underlying assumption of many of these affirmative defense and safe harbor laws as well. And so, and safe harbor is another one of these protections that have been enacted across the country, right? Creating a paradigm shift away from the juvenile justice system into the child welfare system, and creating a child welfare response when children are arrested or picked up for prostitution or other sorts of nonviolent offenses. And then we have vacating conviction statutes, right, which is a post-conviction relief mechanism that have been enacted by a number of states. New York was the first state to enact such a statute, and it had been interpreted somewhat broadly, right, to allow victims to not only have unjust convictions for prostitution removed from the record, but also other nonviolent offenses that were associated with their trafficking victimization. And so again, we see the continuum and the expansion of these protections outside of just what we would look at as commercial sexual exploitation into these other nonviolent crimes. But it begged the question: what about violent offenses that victims end up committing? And this is actually an evolving area of the law, but it also is important in understanding the conversation we're going to have about forced criminality. So, when we in Shared Hope International, termed this idea of victim offender intersectionality. And so this oftentimes came up in the context of what are known as bottoms, right? And these are sex trafficking victims who have engaged in sex trafficking conduct themselves, right? They've helped to facilitate or expand the trafficking enterprise, and now they are subject to prosecution. And I kind of push back against this idea again of victim offender intersectionality, just because I see these victims as victims across the board. On the one hand, they are victims of sex trafficking, but they're also victims of labor trafficking. And when we shift that lens and we begin to look at it in a more expansive view, it allows us a lot more flexibility in the law and how we handle and treat those particular survivors in those particular cases. Now, there are protections that have been expanded to children in these particular instances, right? So Mississippi and South Carolina, for example, have extended their safe harbor laws to also include children who might have been forced to engage in sex trafficking activities themselves, in terms of forcing others to engage in commercial sexual activities. And then there's also an effort that Shared Hope has published and it really encourages law enforcement and others to engage in, which is efforts to mitigate the severity of the punishment when we're looking at these victim offenders, right? And so this is, not using coercive charging techniques, pretrial diversion, using things like human trafficking court, not prosecuting child victims, and using mitigating circumstances and evidence at sentencing to make sure that those who have been charged with sex trafficking or sex trafficking victims themselves don't get these severe punishments. But again, they are both dual labor and sex trafficking victims, with the underlying offenses being the underlying labor trafficking being their forced criminality in terms of their sex trafficking conduct. And then we have, another sort of issue that has arisen in more recent years, with survivors who ended up committing crimes of violence against their abusers. And this is something that has become, come to the forefront in the national consciousness. A number of articles have been written about a number of survivors who have committed offenses against either Johns or their traffickers, and ended up getting a lengthy and severe punishment. So Sarah Cruzan, Centoya Brown, Alexis Martin were all survivors and victims who ended up getting life imprisonment for having committed offenses against their traffickers that oftentimes resulted in the person's death. And it's resulted in a national outpouring of both support and a cry of, why is it that these young victims who everyone acknowledges are victims, everyone sort of recognizes that the system failed them, why were they prosecuted with first-degree murder in the first place, given the fact that these young girls had been raped, had been groomed, and had been victimized for so long? and then they finally, acted out against their trafficker, right? And why doesn't the self-defense laws, protect them? And so, we have on the one hand victims whose offenses were committed against their traffickers, and then we have other survivors like Zephy Trevino, who's being prosecuted right now in the state of Texas, as well as Kiana Aldridge, who was recently released in California, whose crimes were committed against Johns who were attempting to buy them, but again, at the behest of their trafficker, right? So the trafficker was forcing them to engage in underlying criminal conduct that happened to be of a more serious, violent nature, right? And again, these children should fall into that same sort of bucket because we recognize that they're sex trafficking victims, that they're being forced to engage in activity against their will, and that also includes underlying criminal offenses. And so the problem with the system right now is that we kind of have this tension where we're willing to recognize them as victims in certain instances, but not in others. Right. And that is an inherent tension that we as both a movement, but also as a nation really need to grapple with because, these are child victims who essentially we are sending to adult prisons for decades on end. And it's not just in the labor trafficking and gang context, but it's also happening to sex trafficking victims. We're also in these situations where they do not feel free to leave, that they're oftentimes again under serious duress and threats of violence, and there's not really a way out for them, right? So it's important that we recognize that for a lot of child victims, both of sex and labor trafficking, that they are tied together in this instance. And until we address the fundamental failures of the underlying system, we're going to see many, many kids who come into the system who continue to be victimized and then continue to get these very lengthy prison sentences. The last case that I want to talk about right now, because it goes back to the affirmative defense statute that we just saw in the last slide, is that of Crystal Kaiser. Many folks are probably familiar with her case. If you're not, yeah, she is currently being prosecuted in the state of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Supreme Court actually just heard oral arguments last month on whether or not Wisconsin's affirmative defense statute actually applies to violent offenses. Crystal ended up killing the man who had been trafficking, raping, and abusing her. The tragic situation of her case was that her trafficker actually had been arrested 2 weeks prior to the murder. He was found with several caches of child pornography, which also included images of Crystal. For some unknown reason, he was released on his own recognizance, only to continue to abuse and exploit other young women, mostly Black girls. And Crystal was one of them. She went over to his house 2 weeks after his release, ended up killing him. And ever since then, the Kenosha County Prosecuting Attorney's Office has continued to seek the harshest possible charge and sentence for her, which is first degree murder and life without parole. And so the question remains for the court of Wisconsin to decide whether or not the affirmative defense statute is broad enough to apply to violent crimes that were committed as a result of the person being trafficked. And so there's a lot of implications for that ruling from a jurisprudential standpoint, both locally in Wisconsin, but also nationally, potentially. So this is very much an evolving area of the law, but the focus has primarily been around sex trafficking victims who end up, because of their exploitation, committing an offense or some sort of crime against their abuser, or end up committing an offense at the behest of their trafficker. And then the question is, what are the scopes of protections that apply in those particular contexts, right? But it's really important to understand that these issues don't apply just to sex trafficking victims, but also to labor trafficking victims, and that there's this continuum of exploitation in our expansive understanding of what human trafficking is. And there's a similarity of the same sorts of vulnerabilities that make sex trafficking victims vulnerable to exploitation are many of the same vulnerabilities that make children vulnerable to exploitation in labor trafficking, including in forced criminality, right? There's a process oftentimes of grooming. There's a process of exploitation, and we see similar dynamics as well with children who are exploited, and there being older adults who are involved in the exploitation of the child. So in my case, and I'll just briefly talk about my story. For those that are interested, you can learn a little bit more about my whole story. There's a chapter that I wrote in that was published by Springer Publishing called "The Lost Boy." If you Google that, there's also an article that my alma mater wrote. That there's the link on the on the slide that you can click on. But my story resulted in the passage of AB 146 in Nevada, which was the involuntary servitude of minors. And I had never identified as a human trafficking survivor before. I was working at Polaris Project at the time. For those that are familiar, they run the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. And I had gotten involved in Sarah Cruzan's case back in 2010, and I had gotten her file from her pro bono attorneys, and I was reading through what she had experienced. And as I was reading through her file, a series of light bulbs started to go off in my mind. It was like, oh wow, like this, what she experienced in terms of the grooming process was very similar to what I had experienced from a parent of another child in my Boy Scout group. I had always known that I had been sexually abused by this person, but I never really kind of put together that I might have been a victim of labor trafficking. And in my situation, I was abused and victimized by this parent who sexually abused me for a number of years from the age of, started when I was 13 till the time I was about 16. But I ran away from my home during this time, and I lived with this person and their family. And during that time, I developed a traumatic bond with my abuser. And as a result of that traumatic bond, I was willing to do anything for them, right? And so that included, common household chores, taking care of kids, younger children, cooking, cleaning, all of that. And so for a period of about 2 years, that was my life. And I was willing to do anything for this person because I really believed that I loved them, right? But it wasn't until years later, in sort of recognizing the grooming process and how traumatic bonds can be used to really exploit children in very terrible ways. It happens, we know in the sex trafficking context where those trauma bonds are used to compel young girls and boys into commercial sexual activities. But that trauma bond can be used in a variety of different ways, right? Not just in that context, but also to exploit children for labor, for services. And so, and I share that because for me, that was the eye-opening experience of understanding just how expansive human trafficking and child exploitation actually can be, and recognizing the need to sort of look at a variety of different situations through this more expansive lens. And when we're thinking about children who are in gangs and children who are forced into all sorts of labor trafficking situations, it's important to recognize the impact that trauma has on their own vulnerabilities, and then the impact that trauma bonding potentially has, right? Especially in the context of a lot of the communities in which we talk about, where there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of abuse that happens, and what that can do to a child who's looking for love, affection, belonging, right? When an older adult gang leader comes along and offers those sorts of things to that child. So through shifting our lens and understanding the ways in which these paradigms apply, not just in the context of sex trafficking, we can understand that there are a lot of children in labor trafficking situations in gangs that this also applies to. And so, in thinking about this in the U.S. context, there has been a recognition on the part of the U.S. government, and we see this sometimes in the T visa cases. There's been a recognition that children, as well as others who are forced to be drug mules or to traffic drugs across the U.S. border at the threat of violence, including to the point of death or harm to their family members, those individuals are in fact victims of a form of forced labor. And on the left-hand side there are a couple of headlines. If you Google those, that you could read a couple of those articles. But we see these very violent gangs and armed groups and militias in South and Central America beginning to force more and more children into these situations where they have to carry drugs and traffic drugs across the border and into the U.S. And again, when we look at the elements of forced labor and labor trafficking, it fits perfectly within that paradigm, which is why, these children in this particular context have been recognized as victims of trafficking. But it also begs the question that, if we're recognizing that children in these situations who have been forced to traffic drugs are victims of trafficking, why do we stop there with just that particular type of crime? And again, we've also recognized this in the sex trafficking context, where sex trafficking victims who've been forced to carry drugs for their traffickers also should have those convictions vacated from their record, as well as have protections in place so that they're not prosecuted for those crimes, right? And so then the question becomes, how do kids who are involved in gangs fit within that broader paradigm? And so there is a recognition under the Palermo Protocol, and we don't have specific statutes in place that target the use of child soldiers or sort of recognize child soldiers in gangs here in the United States. But the U.S. is a party to the optional protocol on the use of child soldiers in armed conflict zones. And there's a broad recognition that these child soldiers are actually victims of labor trafficking and the sorts of things that they're forced to do, right? And that's all sorts of crimes, including murder, kidnapping, everything at the behest of these armed militias is a form of labor. And that these children, because they are forced and compelled to engage in this, really need to be protected and not prosecuted, right? And so this is actually from a report from Human Rights Watch, where they talk about thousands of children being forced to serve as soldiers in armed conflict zones, some as young as 8 years old. And many, again, are abducted and recruited through force, while others join out of desperation. I think that in the United States, we oftentimes have this view in our minds of what it means to be a child soldier, that all child soldiers were abducted from their homes and then sort of conscripted into these armed militias, kind of similar to what we see in the United States with some of the false myths and narratives around child sex trafficking, sort of the whole sort of taken narrative, right? And what people tend to think about when they think about sex trafficking. We oftentimes hold those same sorts of views for child soldiers. But the reality is, with all the research that's been done, it's a lot more complicated of a picture than just a child being picked up from their home and being forced at the point of a gun. Certainly that does happen, but there are also other circumstances that lead children to from their mind, right, joining these armed militias. So some of the research that's been done in this area and looking at other child soldiers in other areas of the world, they oftentimes, don't see themselves as these helpless victims. There was a study about 10 years ago that saw that, oftentimes kids in these war-torn countries have limited opportunities, but still, see themselves acting with a degree and measure of agency. They make a number of decisions on a daily basis, and they have some level of satisfaction of what they're doing in pursuit of this broader cause, right? And so when we think about, and this sounds very familiar as well. So if you talk to kids who are parts of gangs, right, the same sort of idea is that there's not this idea that they are this victim, but rather they're making a conscious choice. And that should sound familiar to folks who are familiar in the sex trafficking context as well. Oftentimes victims don't identify, right, in that moment as victims. They think of themselves as making conscious decisions and conscious choices. And that applies again across the paradigm of both labor and sex trafficking, as well as children that we see in armed conflict zones. Some other important similarities to highlight is the significance of trauma in the lives of these children, both in terms of the trauma that they experienced prior to their conscription into these armed conflict groups, as well as what trauma they experienced during the course of carrying out the orders that were forced upon them by the leaders of these groups, right? And so it's really important to understand that dynamic, right? Because we see, the trend of serious trauma being a catalyst for kids to be exploited in these sorts of situations, but also the additional trauma of what happens when a child is forced to kill somebody. is forced to torture somebody, is forced to abduct somebody. That isn't something that simply just goes away or sits with people, right? That's additional trauma that the child carries with them. And so when we look at a lot of the studies, again, looking at youth in the United States and in the gang context, right, there's a lot of similarities that we can draw there. You know, starting with the fact that the risk factors for children to join gangs are, again, high exposures to adverse childhood experiences as well as trauma that, you know, include everything from physical and sexual abuse to, you know, having a dysfunctional home environment to broader community violence in which they live. Notably, when they look at girls in the gang environment as well, many of them are victims of sexual victimization and intimate partner violence. Some estimates put the number at roughly 1/3 to 2/3 of girls who are in gangs having been previously sexually abused, right? And the numbers from Rights for Girls suggest that about 73% of all girls who are in the juvenile justice system were victims of both physical and sexual violence prior to becoming system involved. And this is known as the sex abuse to prison pipeline. So we can look at all of the trauma that children experience as being sort of a catalyst both into delinquent behavior as well as to their susceptibility to joining criminal street gangs. And many folks are also probably familiar, I'm not going to go through this list too much, but many folks are probably familiar with ACEs, the ACEs study. But I wanted to put this up here because it's relevant for the next slide when we talk about the prevalence of ACEs in kids in the legal system more broadly, right? But again, there is this really direct connection between the trauma that a child has experienced and then their subsequent involvement in delinquent or criminal behavior. So studies out of Florida have found that roughly 90% of kids in the juvenile justice system have experienced at least 2 ACEs, with 48% experiencing 4 or more. For girls, it was about 45% of them experienced 5 or more ACEs. So again, sort of looking at all of the traumas that children experience prior to system involvement, we can begin to see these broader themes that play out. The same sorts of things that make children vulnerable to trafficking are the same sorts of things that make them vulnerable to becoming system involved. And oftentimes there's an overlap, right? So it's really important that we don't compartmentalize these kids into different systems, because the kids that are being exploited in trafficking and being victimized in this way, who may or may not be coming into the system for, you know, prostitution or other nonviolent crimes, those are the same kids that are becoming system involved anyway, right? And so we have to understand that there's this overlap between the two, and this recognition that trauma plays a significant role in the vulnerability of kids to join gangs in the first place, as well as their subsequent involvement in the juvenile criminal legal system. And not surprisingly, there is a relationship between the rate of exposure to trauma and the more serious offenses that people commit. And so this was a study that was done several years back of kids who were sentenced to life without parole. And as you can see, there's a significant relationship between violence that they saw in their homes, witnessed in their neighborhoods, as well as the rates of physical and sexual violence that girls and boys both had experienced. So when we're looking at youth specifically in gangs in the US context, and this data comes from the National Gang Center, but the last approximated estimate was that there are 30,000 gangs and 150,000 gang members. What was unique about this was that roughly a third of those individuals were people who were under the age of 18. So approximately 283,000 youth nationally, which is a significant number, right? And we can sort of look at, you know, this idea that, okay, so we have 850,000 gang members. Most of them are adults, but some of them are children, right? And a significant number of them are children. And so, you know, in the trafficking context, oftentimes what we're looking for, right, is power dynamics and what is the nature of a particular relationship, and trying to identify how exploitative that relationship is. It's oftentimes easy, right, in the context of adults and children, because we can say there's an inherent power imbalance because children are looking to adults for guidance, for understanding of what they should or should not be doing. But that becomes compounded in the context of gangs when you have children who have dysfunctional home environments, right, where they're victims of abuse, neglect. They don't have their basic needs met. They don't have food. They don't have shelter. right? And then all of a sudden, an older adult gang leader comes along and says, I will give you these things. I will give you that sense of belonging and love that you're looking for, right? Sounds very familiar, right? We see that a lot in the sex trafficking context, right? You know, and there might not be the same sort of exploitative sexual abuse going on in the context of gangs with boys as there is in, you know, with the trafficker and younger girls, but the dynamic and the exploitative dynamics around that situation are very, very similar, and how children can develop trauma bonds, especially when we know that violence is a common theme and staple of the culture of gangs, right? Being jumped in, being jumped out, having to regularly engage in violent activities, being threatened with violence if you refuse to engage in a particular behavior, right? All of those things can create this dynamic around, again, trauma bonds and result in a form of Stockholm syndrome for these kids that oftentimes goes unidentified, but is very similar, again, to kids who are in armed conflict zones in other areas of the world. And so I'd like to play right now a video of a young man who, his name is Xavier, and his story, I think, is emblematic of what a lot of young kids who are recruited into gangs go through. His story was recently profiled in People magazine. He is the co-executive director of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. And so I'm going to share this brief video, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how his story fits into this forced labor trafficking paradigm.
What do you say to people who you've harmed so badly? What do you know, do you look them in their eyes? Do you smile upon entering that door? Do you shake their hand? You know, like, how do you even deal with that?
Xavier McElrathbey remembers the day he first met the family of Pedro Martinez. Xavier was 13 years old with a long rap sheet when he was part of a gang that killed 14-year-old Pedro.
I told myself, I said, Xavier, if they yell at you, if they shout at you, if they call you names, if they hit you, I don't care if they hit you, don't even defend yourself. Like, you deserve it. Like, that's how I felt in my heart, you know? But that's nothing. Oh my God, none of that happened.
Pedro's family only wanted answers about what happened that night in Chicago in 1989. Xavier was serving as lookout for his gang, who lured Pedro into a building and beat him to death. At the time, Xavier felt the gang provided him with what his own family couldn't.
A lot of that, honestly, was me just trying to get away from an abusive stepfather during that time of my life. I was heavily dependent upon my gang for survival, and that often meant being out late night in the streets with them.
At 14, Xavier was tried as an adult and sentenced to 25 years. The judge told him he would never change. Words that haunted him. Xavier was released after 13 years for good behavior, went on to get a master's degree, and is now the co-director of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth.
I think that a lot of what I went through, a lot of what I witnessed my friends go through, and sadly what I'm still witnessing today, are some of the greatest children's rights violations known in the world.
Xavier's story of redemption got media attention, resulting in an email from Pedro's younger sister, Cynthia Alonso.
And in that email, Cynthia said, you know, we've been following you, and we like what you've done with your life.
When they met in person, Xavier told them how Pedro had changed his life.
He started crying like a baby, and he wouldn't stop crying. But then my brothers got up and they approached him and they said, "Don't cry, you know, we forgive you. You know, we have no hate towards you, and we understand that you were a child yourself. So you were like a victim too."
Cynthia supports Xavier's crusade that children don't have the capacity to realize the magnitude of their actions.
I have a child around that age, and when I see him, it's like he talks about toys. He uses things that, I mean, I cannot imagine a 13-year-old having the imagination of hurting somebody else. But in my heart, I believe that it was never his intention to hurt my brother. I believe, in our hearts, we gotta forgive because that's what God wants from us. Because hate and anger only hurts ourselves at the end of the day.
I just want the world to know that no child's born bad. If we want a better, if we want something better for our kids, we have to embrace them as our own and love on them, and give them the support that they deserve.
Hey guys, we are giving out
Okay. And so let me go back to the PowerPoint here. And so, Xavier obviously has a very powerful story and life narrative. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail in discussing sort of how his particular case fits within the forced labor and forced criminality paradigm, right? And so, and it's hard to capture all of this in a 3-minute video, but wanted to kind of give everyone a snapshot of Xavier and sort of his life and what led to his gang involvement. But he was a young man who grew up on the south side of Chicago in a very impoverished neighborhood called Back of the Yards. And this is the late early 1980s. And like a lot of kids who end up joining gangs, suffered from a lot of the same sorts of vulnerabilities that we talked about earlier, right? Having significant early childhood trauma, living in poverty, watching his stepfather beat his mother, being a victim of this violence from his stepfather himself. His stepfather was an alcoholic, so having to deal with the alcoholism in the family and in the house on a regular basis, being a victim of neglect, being homeless. He talks about sleeping in abandoned buildings at times and feeling more safe sleeping in abandoned buildings than he did in his own home because of the violence that could happen at any moment as a result of the stepfather. His younger brother suffered from a mental illness. He was an undiagnosed schizophrenic, and having to live with that and not understand what his brother was dealing with, parental separation, right? All of these things against the backdrop of living in a community that was rife with gang violence, and where it was really you join a gang or you go unprotected. And so Xavier was recruited and joined his gang at 11 years old, right? So put this into context. We're talking about a kid who's in elementary school, right? A 4th or 5th grader, essentially. His first run-in with the justice system happened when he was 9 years old, right? So he was, 3rd, 4th grade. He was hungry. He stole a candy bar, right? So these are the backgrounds oftentimes of the kids that we're talking about. At 11, in addition to, having joined the gang, he was also a victim of a gunshot wound. One of his friends, him and another boy his age, were playing with a gun. Gun goes off. Xavier is shot in the face, right? He was subsequently charged actually with obstruction of justice for refusing to tell on his friend who had shot him, right? So he was, criminalized for his own victimization in the case. And significantly, what's really important is that the person who was Xavier's gang leader, and the gang, it was the Latin Kings gang in Chicago, for those that are wondering. He was 27 years old. 27 years old. So, it's the same sort of dynamic, right, that we see in the sex trafficking context all the time. Older adult men who, prey upon and exploit younger children, right? And that same dynamic oftentimes plays out in the gang context as well. And Xavier's case is a great example of that. And, we talked a little bit earlier about the dynamic of trauma, both, the trauma that leads kids into to join armed groups in other areas of the world, but also the trauma that they experience when they're forced to engage in crimes themselves. Now, in Xavier's case, he served as a lookout while the 27-year-old gang leader took 14-year-old Pedro Martinez into an area in the neighborhood and beat him to death. So Xavier's role in the offense was to serve as a lookout. Now, and then also to help to dispose of the body. Now, when Xavier goes home, he tells the story of just crying, crying himself to sleep because of what he had been a part of and what they had done, right? And again, this is the trauma response to children who, are witnesses to violence, but also engage in and perpetrate violence themselves, right? So very similar, again, to kids who are child soldiers in other areas of the world, where they may believe that they are acting with a sense of agency, right? And to some degree, they have some limited agency, just like many other children have limited forms of agency, but because of their background, because of their experience, and because there's an older adult in the mix, right? That those decisions aren't really decisions at all, right? And so it's really important to understand that when we're looking at these cases through the lens of the labor trafficking statutes, right? And so, I have up on the screen here on the left-hand column the net definition of forced labor, and then some of the different forms of coercion that are used to compel kids who are in gangs to continue to engage in or continue engaging in different types of crimes. And so when we're talking about gangs and crimes, right, there's a whole host of different crimes that children who are in these situations may end up committing. One of the more prevalent ones that have been the subject of a lot of discussion as of late are carjackings that have been happening, but we also see drug trafficking, human trafficking, robberies, right? There's all sorts of these homicide, like in the context of Xavier's case. So all of these very, very serious sorts of crimes end up being committed by gangs. And then when children are a part of that, right, they're arrested and prosecuted as well. And the point here, though, is to understand how the forced labor trafficking statutes can actually be used to see these kids as victims and to actually prosecute the gang leaders, right, for forced labor or forms of labor trafficking, right? So when we look at labor services through the lens of some sort of forced crime, right? So whether it's drug trafficking or whatever the case may be, where means of force, threats of force, physical restraint, or serious harm are used. And again, remember the definition of serious harm is a subjective one. So we're looking at the method of coercion through the lens of a child in the same situation and of the same background. So when you have a 13-year-old like Xavier was at the time, and a 27-year-old gang leader who is telling them, you are going to do X, Y, or Z, or you're going to be, killed yourself, you're going to be met with violence, we're going to kill your family, right? That doesn't leave a whole lot of room for choice for a 13-year-old who's already seen these older adult gang leaders do terrible things themselves, right? Including commit a first-degree murder right before their eyes, right? So we can see children acting out of a sense of fear, paralyzed by fear, and going along with some of these underlying crimes because of the exploitative nature of the relationship and the power imbalance between older adult gang leaders and children who are in these situations, right? So it's a dual tool that we can really use. On the one hand, going after people who are recruiting kids into gangs, particularly older adults, who are forcing them into these situations, but also recognizing that those children themselves are victims, right? And by shifting that paradigm, not only are we going to identify a lot more child trafficking victims in the United States, but we're also going to be able to go after these older adult gang leaders who oftentimes avoid prosecution for these offenses. As an aside, Xavier and a number of other kids were successfully prosecuted for this offense. He got 25 years. The older adult gang leader, who was the one who orchestrated and carried out the murder, did not serve a day in prison. Why? Because he was an adult who was smart enough to have known the system, completely gamed it, essentially refused to talk. None of the other kids, out of fear, did not implicate the gang leader in the underlying homicide. And so he avoided prison time altogether. Meanwhile, all of these children got significant prison sentences, right? And so, for the sake of protecting our kids, kids who are vulnerable and being recruited into gangs, it's really important to think about using these statutes to actually prosecute gang leaders as traffickers when they're recruiting young children into their midst, but then also recognizing these children as victims as well. So again, going back to the number that we talked about earlier, there are 283,000 kids roughly, right, who are in gangs today. And the question that I would pose is, how many of those 283,000 children might be rightly qualified as victims of child labor trafficking through forced criminality, right? And it's until we start asking the appropriate questions and beginning to recognize that these children might in fact be labor trafficking victims, we're going to continue to see them churn through the system, be prosecuted, and the people who are actually responsible for the underlying offenses, the older adult gang leaders, are going to escape prosecution and accountability, right? In order to effectively break up these gangs, my belief is we need to go after the adults who are using the children as pawns in these situations, and recognizing again that those youth are victims and that they need to be protected the same way that we would protect other victims of human trafficking. So just like sex trafficking victims before them who were seen as, in term, quote unquote, child prostitutes, girls who were making these choices, gang involved youth were labeled as super predators and subject to the harsh laws that allowed them to be tried as adults. We know that every year, approximately 53,000 children are prosecuted as adults, some as young as 10 years old in some states. Here in Maryland, the minimum age for prosecution as an adult is 14. But we see kids all the time get very significant sentences, right? And the reality is that they might actually be a victim of child labor trafficking themselves if we just dug a little bit deeper to kind of figure out what their situation is, what were the dynamics that resulted in their participation in the gang to begin with, what were the circumstances that led to them to join the gang, why did they stay a part of it, right? And by asking those questions, we'll have a better sense of what those children have experienced, as well as the potential victimization that they might have experienced at the hands of older adult gang leaders. And this begs a larger question, right? How many of these individuals might be in our prisons today? We recently did an analysis of the children who are currently incarcerated in Maryland's prisons, or people who were children rather, at the time that they committed their offenses. And we found that over 1,100 people are currently incarcerated in Maryland for crimes that they committed as children. 80% of those individuals are Black. It's one of the worst racial disparities that we see in the United States. And again, those kids are in there for, those individuals are in there for a variety of different offenses, but some undoubtedly are in there for offenses they committed as a result of being in a gang. And we don't know, just like we don't know currently today, how many sex trafficking victims across the United States are currently incarcerated for crimes that they committed at the behest of their sex traffickers. That same question can be posed in this scenario as well, because we're not really seeing those kids as victims of labor trafficking or forced labor. And so with that, I want to leave you all before we open up the Q&A with a quote from William Wilberforce, who was the namesake of the original TVPA back in 2000. Mr. Wilberforce, as many of you know, was the person who led the effort to abolish the mid-Atlantic slave trade, or the importation of slaves into the United Kingdom. And that subsequently, a few years later, resulted in the abolition of slavery in the United Kingdom, and sort of laid the foundation for the abolition of slavery worldwide. And Mr. Wilberforce said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know." Similarly here, we've tried to outline how these children fit within the trafficking paradigm, and how many of them may in fact be victims of forced labor and labor trafficking. And it's incumbent upon us, social workers, folks in law enforcement, to really do the due diligence to understand that these children, if they are in fact labor trafficking victims, need to have a different approach, that we need to target the older adult gang leaders, and that these children really need to be protected in the same way that we're trying to protect other victims of human trafficking. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
James, let me first off by saying, and you can see it in the chat, I mean, this was an incredible discussion, incredible conversation. I said it in the beginning, so critical to helping us really rethink the way that we look at juvenile crime. And I think you've opened so many eyes today and given insight to our attendees to really begin to kind of rethink this. My one question to you, just in terms of changes that we need to make, what are your recommendations for, policies in Maryland to really begin to help us kind of move in this direction? Maybe kind of taking the page and, learning from what was done, in years past about decriminalizing youth victims of child sex trafficking. Like, how do you see Maryland kind of moving forward to really grant the protections needed for kids being forced to commit crimes that are winding up in our juvenile service system, adult correctional systems? Like, how do we implement policies to really get to kind of the root of what, this really is?
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's two different tracks, right? So on the one hand, from an implementation standpoint and looking at how the current trafficking statutes in Maryland are being used, on the one hand, looking at investigations of criminal gangs and when children are identified and there's older adult gang leaders who are identified, looking at how the criminal statutes actually could be used to prosecute those individuals and added a layer of protection for the children, right? And kind of having this dual approach too, right? Where it's you want to go after the older adult gang leaders, but you also want to make sure that you're not throwing the book at these younger kids who've been forced into these situations. And so there's a variety of different ways to go about that, right? I mean, everything from charging decisions that are made, whether or not, from a prosecution standpoint, a child is going to be prosecuted in juvenile or adult court, right? There's a lot more opportunities available to them in juvenile court than there is in adult court. And then the need for policy changes so that if a child is in fact prosecuted as an adult, that judges are required to consider mitigating factors of youth, where they specifically look at a child's trauma history and what is the relationship between trauma, the child's involvement in the system, and whether and to what extent an older adult co-defendant was involved in that underlying offense, right? And through that process, judges, will be better equipped to make decisions that really center child status as well as the child's trauma history. And so those are a couple of ideas, and these ideas are beginning to gain steam around the country. Like I mentioned too, the safe harbor law just recently passed the legislature here in Maryland, but it leaves out again sex trafficking victims who've been convicted of violent offenses, right? And so there was a bill, Senate Bill 769, House Bill 754 by Senator Lee and Delegate Lopez, that would have provided those additional protections to sex trafficking victims who had committed acts of violence or serious violent offenses, particularly against their traffickers, right? And so we need those sorts of policies to maximize judicial discretion. We also need prosecutors and folks in law enforcement to also shift the lens through which they're looking at these vulnerable children.
Yeah, and just before we close out, I know yesterday we had a panel presentation on primary prevention, youth-focused primary prevention, and I think like so many of our attendees, might be working with youth in situations where they can recognize some of these vulnerabilities towards being recruited into gang situations, and just taking this information from this presentation and even, exercising or engaging in primary prevention by talking with youth about the same tactics that gang leaders use to exploit vulnerabilities, to make sure that we're protecting youth, to kind of acknowledge this, that the same way that we were doing with youth, kind of educating them around predatory practices of traffickers. I think at its kind of its core, the folks that are attending this presentation can walk away with new insight, new knowledge, and being able to take that and have these conversations with kids about kind of educating them the same way. So I wish we had more time, James. There's questions coming in the Q&A. There's comments just really, again, kind of singing praise just about how this is such a paradigm shift and so needed within our society, within, our collective professional practices, beginning to really kind of come together around this issue. So at this point, James, I again, thank you so much for being a part of this, for providing such an insightful and powerful closing presentation to our conference. Delighted to have you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Neil. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, James, for this amazing plenary. Thank you to Neil for moderating this session. As a movement, we are definitely ready to continue to transform our thinking about child labor trafficking in much the same way that we have been considering child sex trafficking. And I think your presentation truly outlines how much work we still have left to do. Criminal youth gang members are definitely, in the way you've set out, child labor trafficking survivors, and we do owe them services, not punishment. So I appreciate your providing us this lovely and insightful talk this morning. As we close out our conference, I would ask that you all please join me in thanking everyone that was involved in being a part of this conference. Please fill out the conference evaluation before you go. The link is in the chat now. It's a Qualtrics link. Thank you for attending. I would like to truly send appreciation and thank yous to all who made this conference possible. Our Maryland Child Trafficking Conference Planning Committee, which was comprised of Janet Max of Healthy Teen Network, along with Shamir McKenzie, Jamie Sokolis, Tiffany Carty, Kelly Smith, Roxy Farrow, my PARI team, Roshan Stewart, Caroline Harmondero, Neil Mallon, Nikki Agarwal, Kieran Burris. Thank you to our sponsors, Katie Peterson and Denise Conway of the Maryland Department of Human Services, especially to Katie Peterson, who has done a lion's share of work to make sure that those of you who need CEUs are able to get them from DHS. Thank you to Heather Amador and Yasim Karaman of the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. To our Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force partners in Shamir McKenzie, Jessica Dickerson, Joseph Baldwin, all at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work. I thank you, I salute you, kudos to you for all that we've done together. Next week, you will all receive follow-up materials, including video links to the sessions that we were able to record. There have been some technical glitches, but for the ones we were able to record, you will get video links. The CEUs will be issued by the Department of Human Services for those who already registered using that option. Thank you again, Katie Peterson, for your assistance with that task. We will be in touch with you soon if you requested CEUs and attended all sessions. And once again, if you have not already, please complete the evaluation form. Thank you. Thank you so much for attending our conference, and we look forward to seeing you in some way, shape, or form in the next year. Goodbye.